A 70-year-old farmer in 1st century Judea could chew through dense barley bread without pain. His teeth were intact. His bones were strong enough to carry water jars up hillsides. He worked from sunrise to sunset without the crashes, the brain fog, the inflammation that plague us today. He wasn't special. He didn't have access to medicine we lack. He had something simpler, something we've lost. It was in the bread, not the bread you buy in plastic sleeves at the supermarket, not even the artisan loaf from the bakery down the street. The bread that sustained Judea 2,000 years ago was fundamentally different in how it was made, what it contained, and what it did inside the human body. This wasn't about mysticism or divine intervention. It was about wheat, water, fire, and time. 4 elements combined in ways we've since abandoned. The archaeological evidence is clear. Skeletal remains from the time of Jesus show bone density that puts modern populations to shame. Tooth enamel that lasted decades. Bodies that endured manual labor well into what we now call old age. Meanwhile, our store shelves overflow with fortified and enriched bread that contributes to the very diseases those ancient people rarely faced. What changed? And what did they know that we've forgotten? Every morning, before the sun cleared the hills of Judea, a woman knelt beside a stone mill in her courtyard. The mill was simple. 2 circular stones, one fixed, one rotating. A wooden handle. A shallow bowl carved into the upper stone where she poured the grain. She ground wheat, sometimes barley, depending on the season and what the family could afford. The kernels went in whole, nothing removed, nothing refined, nothing stripped away. This wasn't a choice born from virtue. It was necessity. There was no industrial process to separate bran from endosperm, no machinery to sift out the germ, no chemical bleaching to turn flour white. The result was coarse flour, dark, flecked with pieces of the outer kernel. When you held it in your hand, you could still see what it had been. This flour contained everything the grain had grown to protect its own seed. The bran, rich in fiber that would slow digestion and steady the release of energy. The germ, packed with vitamins B and E, healthy fats and minerals. The endosperm, which held the carbohydrates but was never isolated from the elements that made it digestible. Grinding took time. An hour, sometimes more, depending on how much the family needed. The upper stone wore down the grain gradually, generating friction but not the intense heat of modern milling. Heat destroys nutrients. Stone grinding, slow and deliberate, preserved them. By the time the sun was fully up, she had enough flour for the day's bread. It would be used within hours. It wouldn't sit in a sack for weeks, wouldn't oxidize, wouldn't lose potency. Fresh flour, whole grain. Nothing added, nothing taken away. This was the foundation. What came next would determine whether that grain became fuel for the body or a burden on it. The taban oven stood in the courtyard, built from clay and stone. It was shaped like a beehive, waist-high, wide enough at the base to hold several flat loaves pressed against its inner walls. The opening at the top vented smoke. The opening at the bottom fed the fire. Wood was precious in Judea. Olive wood, when available, dried grapevines after harvest, brush gathered from the hillsides. When fuel was scarce, dried dung, sheep, goat, cattle, collected, shaped into cakes, and left to harden in the sun. The woman lit the fire hours before baking. She didn't rush the heat. The clay absorbed warmth slowly, distributing it evenly throughout the chamber. By the time she was ready to bake, the oven's walls glowed with stored thermal energy. She mixed the flour with water, added salt, mineral-rich salt from the Dead Sea, not the stripped sodium chloride of modern tables. Sometimes a splash of olive oil. Sometimes wild honey, if there was a celebration. But the essential transformation happened before the oven. The dough sat. It fermented. Wild yeast lived in the air, on the grain itself, in the residue of yesterday's dough. These microorganisms fed on the flour's sugars, producing carbon dioxide that made the bread rise. But fermentation did something more important than leavening. It broke down phytic acid, a compound in grain that binds to minerals like iron, zinc, and calcium, making them unavailable to the human body. Modern bread, made with commercial yeast and rushed through industrial processes, leaves much of this phytic acid intact. Ancient bread, given time to ferment naturally, neutralized it. Fermentation also began breaking down gluten, the protein structure that gives bread its chew, not destroying it, but transforming it into forms the digestive system could handle more easily. The same gluten that causes inflammation and immune responses in millions today became, through patience and wild cultures, something the body could actually use. The dough rested for hours, sometimes overnight, depending on temperature and the strength of the starter. When it was ready, she shaped it. Flat rounds, sometimes thicker loaves. She slapped each piece against the oven's interior wall, where it clung to the hot clay. The bread baked fast, 5 to 7 minutes for thin loaves, 15 for thicker ones. The intense, even heat created a crust that sealed in moisture while the interior steamed, cooking through without drying out. No thermostats, no timers, just knowledge passed from mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter. The sound of the crust forming, the smell of the grain transforming, the slight darkening at the edges that signaled doneness. She pulled the loaves out with a long wooden paddle. They were dark-crusted, chewy, substantial. You could hold one in your hand and feel its weight. This was food that would sustain a body through hours of labor under the Judean sun. And every element of the process, the stone grinding that preserved nutrients, the wild fermentation that made those nutrients accessible, the clay oven's patient heat that completed the transformation without destroying what mattered, existed in direct opposition to everything modern bread production prioritizes. We chose speed over fermentation, refinement over wholeness, shelf life over nutrition, softness over substance. They had no choice but to do it right, and their bodies showed the difference. Flour, water, salt, time. That was the recipe. Not because ancient bakers were pursuing purity or following some dietary philosophy, because that's what they had. The flour came from wheat or barley grown in soil that hadn't been depleted by a century of industrial agriculture. The grain pulled minerals from earth that still contained them: iron, magnesium, selenium, zinc. What went into the ground came up through the plant and ended up in the bread. The water came from springs or cisterns. No chlorine to kill the wild yeast cultures the dough needed. No fluoride, just water. The salt came from the Dead Sea or from evaporated seawater. It carried trace minerals, potassium, calcium, magnesium, not stripped down to pure sodium chloride and sold back with iodine added as an afterthought. And time. Hours of fermentation that no modern commercial bakery can afford to give. Time that allowed enzymes to work. Time that let beneficial bacteria multiply. Time that transformed grain from something hard for the human gut to process into something it could actually extract nutrition from. Compare this to what most people eat today. Modern bread starts with flour that's been stripped of 25 nutrients, then has 5 synthetic vitamins added back and gets labeled enriched. The bran and germ, the parts that contain fiber, healthy fats, B vitamins, and minerals, are removed because they shorten shelf life. What's left is pure endosperm, ground so fine it behaves like sugar in your bloodstream. Then come the additives, dough conditioners to speed fermentation from hours to minutes, preservatives, calcium propionate, sorbic acid, to prevent mold for weeks, high fructose corn syrup or added sugars to feed commercial yeast and improve browning, hydrogenated oils to extend shelf life, azodicarbonamide, a chemical also used in yoga mats and shoe soles to make dough easier to handle. 20 ingredients, 30, sometimes more. Few of them are food. The goal isn't nutrition, it's shelf stability, production speed, uniform texture, and profit margin. Ancient bread went stale in 2 days. You couldn't produce it in factories, ship it across regions, store it in warehouses. It had to be made fresh, eaten fresh, made again the next day. That limitation was also its strength. Bread that couldn't sit for weeks didn't need chemicals to prevent decay. Bread made in small batches by people feeding their own families didn't get optimized for corporate distribution. It simply had to work. It had to provide energy. It had to keep people alive. And it did. Through decades of physical labor, through pregnancies and harvests and long migrations to Jerusalem for festivals, through winters and summers and the constant demands of survival in a world without safety nets. The bread wasn't supplemented with synthetic vitamins because it didn't need to be. The bread wasn't enriched because nothing had been removed in the first place. 4 ingredients, no shortcuts, no additives, no laboratory substitutes for what time and microbial action accomplish naturally. Just grain, transformed through fire and patience into the staff of life. Not a metaphor. Actual sustenance that built actual bodies. Bodies that didn't break down the way ours do. The difference shows up in what the body does with the food. Ancient bread released its energy slowly. The intact bran created a matrix of fiber that slowed digestion. The fermentation had already broken down complex starches into forms the gut could process without spiking blood sugar. The result was sustained energy, the kind that carried a farmer through a day of plowing, a woman through hours of grinding grain, a traveler through miles of walking between villages. No crash, no sudden hunger an hour after eating, no fog that comes when insulin surges to manage a glucose spike. Modern refined bread does the opposite. The grain has been pulverized into particles finer than the stone ground flour of Judea. The bran is gone, so there's no fiber to slow absorption. The germ is gone, so there's no fat to provide satiety. What's left hits your bloodstream almost as fast as pure sugar. Your pancreas responds. Insulin floods your system to clear the glucose. Blood sugar drops. You feel hungry again. You eat more bread, more refined carbohydrates, more processed food. The cycle repeats. Over years, your cells become resistant to insulin's signal. Your pancreas works harder, produces more, until it can't keep up. Blood sugar stays elevated. Inflammation becomes chronic. Fat accumulates in your liver, around your organs, in your arteries. This is the mechanism behind type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and much of the obesity crisis that defines modern health. None of these conditions were common in first-century Judea. Not because people lived shorter lives. Skeletal evidence shows many reached their 60s and 70s, but because their food didn't attack their metabolism every time they ate. The fermentation mattered in another way. Wild cultures in sourdough starter produce organic acids that lower the bread's glycemic index even further. They also generate enzymes that continue breaking down starches and proteins during baking. The result is bread that not only digests more slowly, but also feeds beneficial bacteria in your gut. Your microbiome, the trillions of organisms living in your intestines, depends on fiber and fermented foods. Ancient bread provided both. Modern bread provides neither. Refined flour feeds the wrong bacteria. Preservatives actively kill the beneficial ones. The gut inflammation that follows affects everything: immune function, mental clarity, nutrient absorption, even mood regulation. The phrase gut health sounds modern, but the principle is ancient. What you eat determines what grows inside you. Ancient Judeans ate bread that supported the microorganisms their bodies needed. We eat bread designed to survive. On a shelf, not to nourish the life inside us. There's also the matter of what's missing. The vitamins and minerals in whole grain, magnesium for muscle and nerve function, B vitamins for energy metabolism, vitamin E as an antioxidant, iron for oxygen transport, were present in every loaf baked in that clay oven. Modern bread strips these out, then adds back synthetic versions of a few. But nutrients don't work in isolation. They require cofactors, other vitamins and minerals that help the body use them. Whole grain provides these naturally. Enriched flour doesn't. The result is bread that fills your stomach but starves your cells. Calories without nutrition. Weight without strength. The people of Judea didn't count calories. They didn't track macronutrients or take multivitamins. They ate food that still resembled what it had been when it grew in the field. And their bodies functioned the way bodies are meant to. Strong bones into old age. Healthy teeth despite no dental care. Stamina for physical labor that would exhaust most modern adults within hours. Not because they were tougher, because what they ate every single day built their bodies instead of breaking them down. The bread didn't just feed them, it sustained them. Across years, across generations, across a span of human history where survival demanded more from the body than we can imagine now. And we wonder why our food leaves us weak. The bones tell the story that words cannot. Archaeologists working in burial sites across ancient Judea have uncovered skeletal remains from the 1st century. The bones of farmers, laborers, craftsmen, people who spent their lives under physical strain that would hospitalize most modern adults within weeks. What those bones reveal contradicts everything we assume about primitive life and limited nutrition. The bone density is remarkable. Not just adequate, robust. Dense cortical bone that indicates a lifetime of adequate calcium, magnesium, and vitamin D. Trabecular bone, the inner scaffolding, showing none of the deterioration that marks modern osteoporosis. These weren't people drinking fortified milk or taking calcium supplements. They were getting minerals from whole grain, from water that still carried dissolved minerals, from vegetables grown in soil that hadn't been stripped by industrial farming. Their bones didn't thin in old age the way ours do. A 70-year-old skeleton from 1st century Judea often shows bone mass comparable to a healthy 40-year-old. Today, then, there are the teeth. Dental remains from the period show where the grinding action of stone-ground grain left its mark on molars. But decay was uncommon. Abscesses were rare. Tooth loss before old age was not the norm. This in a world without toothpaste, without fluoride, without dentists. What they had was bread that didn't bathe their teeth in sugar every time they ate. Fermentation had consumed the simple sugars. What remained were complex carbohydrates that didn't feed the bacteria that cause cavities. Modern teeth, despite all our oral hygiene, rot. Children lose teeth to decay. Adults need root canals, crowns, implants. Not because we brush less than ancient Judeans. They didn't brush at all, but because our food creates an environment in the mouth where destructive bacteria thrive. The skeletal evidence also shows something else. Joint surfaces remain smooth longer. Vertebrae show less compression. Growth plates indicate that childhood nutrition was sufficient for bodies to reach their genetic potential. Compare this to modern populations eating processed diets. Bone density declines earlier. Osteoporosis affects millions, particularly women after menopause. Teeth require constant intervention. Joints degenerate. Spinal compression becomes normal with age. We call this aging. But the bones from Judea suggest it's not age, it's diet. The minerals, the vitamins, the compounds that build and maintain skeletal structure were present in the daily bread. Not added artificially, not injected into the food chain as supplements. Just there naturally, because the grain was whole and the process preserved what mattered. There's no romanticizing this. Life in 1st century Judea was hard. Infant mortality was high. Infections killed. Injuries that we'd treat easily could be fatal. But the chronic diseases that define modern health, diabetes, heart disease, obesity, metabolic syndrome, barely existed. The archaeological record shows bodies that worked, that lasted, that didn't break down from the inside because of what people ate 3 times a day. The bread didn't guarantee long life, but it built bodies capable of enduring the life they had. Stone ground grain, wild fermentation, clay ovens, 4 ingredients, nothing added, nothing stripped away. That was the difference. Not medicine, not genetics, not divine protection. Just food that still functioned as food. Bread that served the body instead of burdening it. We abandoned that knowledge in pursuit of convenience, shelf life, and profit. The cost shows up in our bones, our teeth, our blood sugar, our inflammation markers, our need for pharmaceutical intervention just to manage what food does to us. The people of Jesus didn't have our technology, but their skeletons prove they had something we've lost. And it started each morning with grain ground fresh between 2 stones. The people of Jesus didn't shop for health. They didn't read ingredient labels or compare nutrition facts. They ground grain, mixed dough, lit fires, and waited. 4 ingredients: stone and clay, time and patience. What they created wasn't just bread. It was the foundation of bodies that lasted, bones that stayed strong, teeth that endured, energy that carried them through days of labor we can barely imagine now. We have supermarkets overflowing with options, supplements lining pharmacy shelves, fortified and enriched products promising nutrition that was removed to make them profitable. And we're sicker than they were. The path back doesn't require prescriptions. It requires remembering what bread actually is, what food is supposed to do inside a human body. Not every solution to modern health is ancient, but this one is. If this changed how you see your kitchen, let us know in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe, because we're not done digging into what the ancient world knew that we've forgotten.